Hello everyone, my name is Georgie and this is episode 0 of the Take Out the Trash Day podcast. As you might have noticed before listening to the podcast, this episode 0 is called 5 W's and How, and this is a concept I'm going to base this first episode on. It's a concept often used by journalists to write about certain events and write their stories and articles. It's a concept that answers 6 very basic but very important question that it's believed that one reader, or in this case, you, the listener of this podcast, should know the answer of, and will have all the information needed. The questions are who, what, why, when, and where, and how as the sixth and last question. As I said, it's pretty basic, and I happen to really like it. So that is why I decided to use this very specific method for this trailer episode to get you more familiar with the podcast and the concept I have in mind in just 10 to 15 minutes. I don't want to drag this on more than it should be because it's just a trailer episode where I'm just going to tell you what my idea with this podcast and what Take Out the Trash Day is.
And that brings us to a bigger question about this election. Who are we? What kind of politics do we want to see? What kind of accountability do we expect from our elected officials? You know, it's one thing to have a legitimate policy difference, but if you take one position, then you should be held accountable for the position you take. You can't suddenly pretend you didn't take the position because it is politically expedient. You can't just lie about it. Look, listen. Throughout human history, certainly throughout American history, politicians have exaggerated. They make promises that they may try to fulfill, but then it turns out to be harder than they expected. They pump up the things that they did that were good. They downplay the things that didn't work out so good. They try to put a positive spin on things. And by the way, before you get too down on politicians, we all do that now. You know, when I'm talking to Michelle, sometimes I'm all like, oh, honey, man, do you see I did all the dishes? You know, and she's all like, yeah, but that's like the first time you've done that in a week. What'd you do wrong? And I said, well, we all do that to some degree, right? I mean, it's human nature. But what we have not seen before, in our recent public life at least, is politicians just blatantly, repeatedly, baldly, shamelessly lying. Making stuff up, calling up down, calling black white.
What you just heard was former US President Barack Obama speaking out at a rally in Milwaukee, Wisconsin just this last week. And I wasn't necessarily going to answer why first, but when I saw his speech, when I heard his statement, I felt it was the perfect opening for this episode. And he perfectly sums it up why this podcast. I'm okay with, as he says, a legitimate policy difference. In fact, I love it, and I'm all for it. And I believe that a democracy is not a true democracy, and it's not working if there is no debate between different political activists and politicians with different political differences in their policies. But we live in a world where we have a campaign that won based on lies, as it was the case for Brexit. And we have the President of the United States of America, who since taking office has made 6,420 false or misleading claims. And that is why most of the people hate politics and think all politicians are corrupt and eventually decide not to get out and vote and be politically active. See, that is not true. Yes, politicians, as Obama said, they do put positive spin on things. They do talk a lot about what they have done good and forget all about what they have done bad or not done at all. But not all of them just make stuff up and lie. And you need to see that for yourself. Some people do that. Some people go out there and fact check everything and are really up to date with what's going on. But there are people who either don't have the time or just don't want to bother with that. Because again, they believe all politicians are corrupt and they all lie. So this podcast and I will try to have a rational policy difference debate with people from both sides of the aisle. We'll have liberals and conservatives and people who believe in communism and democracy here and try to debate stuff. I'm gonna try through this platform to keep those in power accountable, because if we don't do that, we are not doing our civic duty. Secondly, what the heck is Take Out the Trash Day, you would ask? So I launched our Instagram and Facebook profiles yesterday, and so far I've been asked multiple times about the meaning of the name. Well, if you're like me and have watched the best TV show ever produced, The West Wing, probably 10 times by now, and you're a journalist or politician or someone who follows politics and watches the news, you probably know what Take Out the Trash Day means. For the rest of you, Take Out the Trash Day, or popularly known as Friday News Dump, is a political term that is used when the government releases their unpopular news stories just before the weekend, as it is believed that few people follow the news on a Saturday rather than following on a Wednesday, Tuesday, or Monday. Not only the timing is effective for what the government wants to hide, but also the act of lumping together as many stories as possible to minimize the effect of each one is great. This podcast will do exactly that. We'll try to educate the public and the people about the different political systems and processes and politics, and do something that no government in the world wants, and give you those unpopular news stories as they are being released. One of my closest friends, Ivo, who made all the design for this podcast, shout out to him, has put the meaning of the term and of the podcast perfectly together, which says the government has wrapped up malevolent nuggets of news and released them all on the last day of term in hope that we'll be too festive to notice. You deserve to know, so you should check out the podcast. So now that you know why I'm doing this podcast and what does the name stands for, it's time to tell you a little bit about myself. Who am I and why do I think I know everything? I'm just a city boy, born and raised not in South Detroit, but instead of Strumica in Republic of Macedonia. And if you don't know where that is, that's totally fine with me, because not a lot of people in the world know. I'm just 19 years old, or I would say a young kid from Macedonia who is studying political science in Skopje, our capital. And I'm involved with politics since a very young age. My first political rally was when I was 3, I think. And when I was 4, my biggest wish was to become a president of Macedonia. And FYI, I still do. I do want to become a president of Macedonia, but on a more serious note, I love politics all my life. But the real reason, and probably the biggest reason for me to go and study politics and be more politically involved, is 2015 and 16 school year, which I spent in Nacogdoches, Texas as foreign exchange student. It just happened to be an election year in the US, so I got pretty caught up with all the primaries and Trump, Hillary, Bernie, Cruz, and Rubio stuff. A lot of debates and a lot of discussion about it. I got to see all the craziness and the madness of the entire political process, and I decided I want to go back in Macedonia. I want to change things, and the first step was studying it and actually knowing what is what when it comes to politics. So this is long story short for me, because I know that over the course of this podcast you'll get to know more about me, hear my story, hear my beliefs, and I do believe it's enough for now. I'm just going to say that I consider myself social democrat, so I'm on the left side of the spectrum, but that really doesn't matter, since this podcast will be a place where I'm not going to talk bad about Trump, conservatives, or people that I don't agree with, but instead, this will be a place where I'm going to try to talk real policy stuff. I'm going to get politics closer to you and fact check everything I say. If by the end of this podcast you don't like politics more than you have before you start listening to me, then I'll consider that I failed in my mission. Now that we have met, that you know a little bit about myself, told you about the concept and the podcast and the reason why I'm doing it, it's only fair if I tell you how it's gonna work and how it all started for me. It was about a year ago now. I've discovered this thing called podcast, and I loved it from the very beginning. And my first podcast I've ever listened to was Pod Save America, and I still listen to those guys. You should definitely check them out and see what they're about. But over the year, I literally stopped listening to music for my commutes, and just in general, I replaced it with podcasts. So at some point, I wanted to start my own, but I never knew what to talk about because there's so many things I'm interested in. But when I started college about a month ago, and all the classes were so interesting and it was so inspiring, I was like, this is it. And then I went to visit Ivo and told him about my idea, and his reaction was, you gotta do it, man. So we researched it, I came up with the name and the concept, he did the design, and here we are. The second how, which is how will it work, or it's the concept of the podcast. Basically, it'll be a weekly thing, 40 minutes to an hour show with different segments. They'll be about political history, political science, and a part where either myself or a guest of mine will give you comments on current events, whether it's going to be Macedonia, Europe, or the world. It's going to depend on the theme of the episode. Every episode will have different theme around it, and I'll also give you my Macedonian take on things, about how we see what's going on in the world from our own perspective, something that I think should be very interesting, especially for those that are not from Macedonia. As I said, it'll be a weekly thing, so when can you hear it? Every Friday, symbolically for the Friday news dump, and you can listen to it literally on every podcasting app there is. I'm using Anchor, so they're distributing it for me, so that's awesome. For those of you that don't listen to podcasts, there are multiple apps for that, like Apple Podcasts, Anchor, Castbox, Overcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, Google Podcasts, and dozens more. You can download it and find me there. Also, if you don't want to download the pod, on some of those apps, you can always check our Facebook and Instagram profile, and there will be a link to it. And I'll try to have it on YouTube every week, so you can put it on and listen to it there. Episode number 1 will be out this Friday, November 9th, and I'll focus on the US midterm elections and the results from it, and the US political system. So you definitely don't want to miss that. I guess this was it. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being patient with me over the course of this first trailer episode I've prepared for you. And hopefully you'll listen to me on Friday. One very last message for those of you that are Americans and listening to me right now. Please vote. Get out there. Vote on Tuesday, because voting is the best thing you can do as a citizen of a country. Georgie out. Talk to you on Friday.